I'm glad I've got some people in here because that means you can ask me real questions and give me real problems.
Everybody fighting in the back.
And I've seen, I suppose like you've seen some interesting stuff happen on Zoom on the camera with people walking in the background.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, my wife had to remind me that I had to dress appropriately from the waist up and the waist down.
There's been a few close calls.
When my daughter was locked down, she's a maths teacher and she has 5th grade, and you can see all the little faces on her screen. And she said, "Well, we're now going to take a 10-minute break and go a bio break, as they call it." And this one kid, you just saw her face, and then you just saw her push back into the pool, like she was just watching the Zoom on the side of the pool. And she pushed her out. That's the way to do school. Okay, well, I'll give you a quick overview of what we're going to do this afternoon, and we're going to take it in whichever direction you want to go. But I want to hit some of the high points of local and recent problems. TJ was reminding me of one big problem that we're having is with multiple offer situations and the attitude of the other side. I want to talk about some of the calls I've been getting where there's a disconnect between the co-broke agent and our side. And I think a lot of the problems are because we actually, generally, we understand the contract and the transaction better than the people on the other side. And the transaction goes off track a little bit because they think one thing and we think the right thing. And so I want to give you some tips of how we can start educating the co-broke a little bit better as to how the transaction is going to progress. I then want to talk a little bit about the differences between the as-is contract and the standard contract, because I've been telling listing agents out there, if you want to bulletproof your transactions, ask for a standard contract. That way you get, when you have a multiple offer situation, people are just not throwing paper at you. They really do want to buy that property and they do want to stay in it for the long run. And the standard contract holds the buyer's feet to the fire a little bit more firmly than the as-is contract. Because if you think about it, you have a multiple offer situation. I was just talking to someone on the way here. They had 17 offers on their listing that went live yesterday. And they're getting bombarded like TJ was with, why didn't you accept my offer? Did you present my offer? The code of practice says, the realtor code of practice in the ethics says that a broker in writing can request from another broker to confirm that an offer has been presented. That rule's been around for a couple of years now and never used it until the last sort of 6 months. And I've been consistently writing to other brokers to ask whether our offer was presented, and the other broker has to confirm in writing that it actually was presented. Because my fear is, we're one of the 6 or 7 buyer agents putting an offer. We don't know whether it got presented because we're not getting any feedback or response from the other side. So it's got me in a nice situation because I've been able to meet and talk to a lot of brokers in that process. The other thing I wanted to talk about is I published that 11 ways that real estate agents get into trouble, and then did a 2020 version, which we're hoping we're giving to the new agents as they're joining. And then if you haven't got a copy of it, I'll be happy, if you email me, I'll be happy to send you a copy of the latest one. It's all pretty much the same stuff, but we'll touch on that this afternoon. And then at any time, if you have any questions, and Debbie, you're monitoring the people that are too scared to come and see me, you can just chip in and we can take it whichever way you want. I want to dig in, first of all, I want to dig into the finance paragraph of the contract. If you think about it, we have a 12-page contract on the as-is, and there's 58 asterisks on the columns on that as-is contract, which means that 58 times we are going to be writing something in that contract. And pretty much as you go through the contract, it's a very logical progression. Page 1 talks about who's buying and selling, what they're buying and selling, real and personal property, when it's going to close, how the offers are going to be dealt with, and then we get into the second page where it talks about what happens at the closing, and then we go through the paragraph 5 and 6, the delays, then the closing, the state of the property at the closing, and then we go into finance, and then we talk about who's paying what in paragraph 9. So it's a logical progression. And then paragraph 10 talks all about the disclosures. And that's the boring stuff. Once you get to paragraph 10, it's just all reading, lots of reading. There's a few little things in there that I want to just touch on because it seems. Does anyone want to guess what the #1 question I get asked? I've been doing this for 5 years, and I can literally say, I'll just pluck a percentage out of my head, but I would say 25% of my questions are about this subject. What would you think it is?
Sewer and septic.
No. But, we'll talk about that. It's the definition of time. That seems to just befuddle people, and how to count days. So I want to hit that first. And it's an easy line number to remember if you smoke marijuana. It's line 420 of the contract, and there's the definition of time. Did you look at
I
didn't look at you. I didn't
Am I getting singled out?
You'll never ever forget, or maybe you will forget line 420. But time is very clearly defined, and where people get messed up is they get messed up on when to start counting and when to stop counting, and what happens when there's a jump from a public holiday or a weekend. So I'm just going to quickly go over that so that at least you guys on Zoom and in here will most probably never have to pick up the phone and ask it. So time is defined as calendar days in the 5x5 as is and the 5x5 standard. And there's only 2 exceptions when we don't talk about calendar days, and that is in paragraph 5A when it talks about the the CFPB extension for 3 days actually counts as Saturday. Never really comes up that often. When it does, it's because people are misinterpreting it rather than interpreting it. But that's the one exception. And then the other exception is time for offer and acceptance. So when you give someone 48 hours to get their answer back on an offer or acceptance, we count if the last day is a Sunday or a Saturday, that's fine. It ends on that particular day. So when you're counting days, you count from the effective date is day 0. So when everyone has sent the contract and addendum backwards and forwards, and the last person that signs it, when it leaves the hands of their agent, that is day 0. Not when it's received. That was a question this morning from someone. Got sent at midnight last night. Yesterday was when it ended. It doesn't, because he opened it at 8 o'clock this morning, it doesn't roll to today. It was from the hands of the sender, means it's been delivered. So that's day 0. Then the next day is day 1. And then the last day of the contingency period, if it lands on a weekend, Saturday or Sunday, or a public holiday, and the public holidays are defined, we just go to the government, and there's a US code called 56103, which gives you all the days which are public holidays. Guess what? Tomorrow is a public holiday. So any contingency periods that you have tomorrow, which is Veterans Day, is it? Yeah.
Tomorrow's Veterans Day. Yeah.
Veterans Day will, if it ends tomorrow, actually will go to 5 p.m. on the next business day, which is Thursday. So the 11th is Veterans Day. If your inspection period ends tomorrow, you actually now get all the way till 5 o'clock on Thursday. So that's how time works for those 2. And calendar days, if you think of old movies, whenever they wanted to say that time was moving forward, you would see like a square with a 1, and it would fly off into the wind. You'll remember them, David. And then 2, and it would fly off, and the days would pass on that calendar. That's what calendar days are. It's the entire day from midnight to midnight. Any questions on time? Good. Yes.
I got one from Yosseff, said, can we cover force majeure and how tropical storm affects? So it's a
Yeah.
little bit different.
Absolutely. Just remind me of that in a
Will
second.
do.
I don't want to blow over that.
Yeah.
I've been missing out on the dad jokes. They've all moved away. They've all moved away. So that's time. And then let's quickly talk about force majeure now. You know, force majeure there's 2 places that force majeure is talked about in the contract. It's in paragraph 5A where it says, 5B, where it says that if utilities and facilities at the place where it is closing are interrupted by a force majeure. So let's just say that there is a hurricane that is heading towards us. The insurance gets shut down, title companies close down. We have automatic extensions until that force majeure is passed. We normally judge it, though there's nothing written, we normally judge it by states of emergency. So if a state of emergency is declared, that's normally a good indication that a force majeure situation is arising. And then force majeure is, if you've got a contract in front of you, just check me if I say the wrong standard, but I think in standard G, it then goes on to define more about force majeure. So the standard section of the contract is A through Z, and there's some that are just reserved and empty. But standard G talks about force majeure and defines it a little bit more. So, you know, right now we haven't got a force majeure situation. We've got a storm billowing out in the Gulf, but it's not causing any problems. From my point of view, what I found was interesting. We dealt with a force majeure situation in Orlando a few years back, but the hurricane actually was in Houston. So Houston got blasted by a hurricane, and the bank that was lending on our loan here was shut down because of that. So we were able to rely on the force majeure provision and extend the contract out. It doesn't have to be in the locality where you're at. So anyone around the country that was borrowing with the First Bank of Houston, they couldn't operate. Therefore, throughout the country, those people that had force majeure provisions in their contracts were able to have their extension.
That also applies for insurance?
Applies for insurance. So if you couldn't get insurance, if you couldn't get, the closing couldn't happen, they couldn't do the final inspections, there was, you know, whatever problem that has been caused by the storm. So it's not definitive, it's always judged by the courts. Many, many years ago, more years than I want to remember, in law school, there was we dealt with force majeure, but we didn't deal with it in real estate, we dealt with it in intellectual property and entertainment. So the Rolling Stones used the force majeure provision of their entertainment contract a couple of years ago and cancelled their concert that was going to take place in New Orleans. And the insurance company that insured that event is I have my sort of best friend ever in the world, who I've been friends with since we were 9. He works for Lloyd's of London and he insures these things. And his insurance policies for the Rolling Stones have force majeure provision, which says that they have the right to cancel and they won't be penalised if there is a force majeure happens in the location where they're going to play. So it's not just real estate force majeure, it works through cruises. If you're a wedding planner, and if you want to be a wedding planner, I would advise you to put a force majeure provision in your contract so that if the wedding's rained out, you're not going to get blamed. That's basically what it is. And then it will be for the court to decide if someone argued, oh no, you could have closed. And this has happened with COVID. We've had lots of people right at the beginning say, oh, this is a force majeure. Well, yeah, it is a force majeure, but will it affect the real estate contract? And therefore we had to talk to Florida Realtors General Counsel and say, can you make a decision on this? And her decision was, this probably isn't a force majeure. we can continue, but what we're going to do is create these several forms for you to use to help you extend contracts because of COVID, because the only person that's going to be able to say this was a force majeure is subsequent court cases if the judge agrees. Most probably told you more information you need, but I've got to say Rolling Stone.
So what's the timeline? So let's say hurricane comes through, you're supposed to close on a weekday, hurricane comes through, everything shuts down. Who says when do you close after that? Who gets to say and how long after things open back up?
When it all settles down. So there's days in there, I think it's 7 days is it initially, and then once it's passed, you then have that amount of time. Normally, it's very fluid, so when the state of emergency lifts, we then got 7 days to get things sorted out.
Okay.
And again, that comes down to your communication skills with the other side, and you know what a lot of them do is just dig their heels in, and they're using it as an excuse to get out for another reason. That and talks about force majeure forever. Debbie.
So on time, just for clarity's sake, it says, so 5A includes weekends, but not public holidays.
5A includes Saturday, but not public holidays. It's when the banks are open for that 3-day trade.
Okay, and then where Yosseff says, if no emergency is established by the state, but all insurance companies have placed moratorium on binding insurance until after the storm, then what happens?
That would still be a force majeure. You could still rely on the force majeure provision. You know, because insurance companies are the first to shut down. That's why we're all, as real estate agents, we get all excited. We're going to be in this big box. You know, I go out in the backyard and look for the line to approach. Here comes the bugs. But yeah, I think we must be, the thing real estate agents do well is send out emails about the time change every year and when the box is coming for insurance. I think those are the two things we really keep. If we stop this time change problem, it's going to really ruin all your 20 touch campaigns or whatever. I don't know how many emails I've got reminding me of the time will change, and there's nothing I have to change. My car does it automatically, my phone does it. It's just my dog is the only person that's affected by this time change. Because he wants his dinner still at 7:30 and 3:30. Anything else on the questions? Okay, so let's now double back and talk about paragraph 8. I like being in the classroom again. Paragraph 8, the finance contingency. Most probably the most misunderstood part of the contract. And it's misunderstood mainly by people on the other side of our transaction. And so I've worked with a couple of teams and worked on some of their communications, and we're going to be talking to transaction coordinators next week. We're going to do the first, for me anyway, the first sort of seminar with transaction coordinators on Monday, and that's going to be a Zoom thing. It looks like we're getting quite a lot of interest in it. And then ultimately, we're going to do a transaction coordinator certification process. I love transaction coordinators. The majority of them do a great job. There are several out there that don't do a good job, and they do more harm to the transaction than they should. And one of the reasons may be that they're overwhelmed with what they're doing. So years and years ago, I started a transaction coordination company, got bored with it in minutes. It's more complex than I wanted to continue with, and I got rid of the company. But what it did was it taught me how to manipulate and manage the co-broke by subliminally messaging them throughout the transaction, and also the parties to the contract, by giving them information that you presume they know, but you don't want to insult them, but you're just trickling it into the threads of your emails to them to remind them of how the contract's going to work. Because basically the contract is just a roadmap. It's just taking you on a journey from offer to closing table. And everything shouldn't be complicated, but it gets complicated when we involve realtors in it, and especially realtors that don't understand things. And paragraph 8 is most probably the most misunderstood, because I still, to this day, hear the word commitment. And commitment was removed from the contract in 2017. The old 5R4, or yeah, 4 it would have been, had loan commitment in it. That created so many problems because it was a lie. It is a lie. It's, men know this. You cannot have a commitment. Nobody can commit to everything without knowing what the end game is. And so a lender was being asked to commit to a loan that wasn't possibly going to be really, really committed to until the pen hit the paper at the closing table. And I don't mean to be mean to men, but I was always accused of not understanding the term commitment when I was a young teenager. So when can the lender commit? Never. Until 1 minute, so maybe 10 seconds before the buyer is signing their name at the closing table. So they did away with paragraph 8 of the 5 contract. They did away with that term commitment and replaced it with approval. And they took lender out of the mix. The only time the lender is mentioned in paragraph 8 is that the buyer is to make diligent effort to obtain the loan, and the seller and the seller's agent can inquire of the lender as to the progress of the loan. And that gives them the right to talk to the lender to get the progression of the loan. How's it going? Seller, seller's agent. No such thing as commitment. And I hear the word commitment time and time every day. As soon as someone gives me a call about paragraph 8, they start talking about commitment. The other side wants the lender to provide a commitment letter. No requirement whatsoever in the contract for that. All we have to understand is that the buyer gives to the seller written notice that they have loan approval. There's no requirement in that contract that says the lender must give anything to the seller, other than answer the phone and give updates as to the progress of the loan. And we mess it up. As an industry, we're messing this up continually because someone on the other side is asking for a commitment. They're not going to get one. They talk about conditional loan approval. There's no such thing. There's either loan approval or there's not loan approval. And loan approval with conditions is the other way of saying that is that they're waiving loan approval and they're going to move forward. So during the loan approval period, I'm going to draw my diagram so it makes sense to me rather than you. Oh, bollocks. Sorry if there's any English people that understand. He handed me a big, there it is, put over here for safekeeping. So we have paragraph 8 is the loan, if you think of that as the loan approval process and the finance contingency, that's the whole of that is the finance contingency. And within the finance contingency, there is the loan approval process. If I just take a few extra seconds, I can write it neatly, I found out. Oh, bollocks. Twice now.
Double bollocks.
Okay. Loan approval period. So within the finance contingency, there's a loan approval period. So once the contract is effective, the buyer has to make their application for the loan, and within the 5 days or however long they wish or they have in the contract, they make their application for the loan, and then they have the loan approval period, which defaults to 30 days. Right now, you could have to have it longer because some lenders say they can't get it done in 30 days, or they say they'll get it done in 30 days, and they don't really mean that. They actually need more time than that. So you have your 30-day loan approval period. During this time, the buyer is going to make diligent effort to obtain a loan. And they do it, and it describes what diligent effort is they're going to provide the lender with all the paperwork that's needed, any information that the lender needs to get the loan. Then at the loan approval deadline, they're going to inform the seller in writing. And buyer in writing to seller, and when I talk about buyer or seller, we're talking about the agents. So you're standing in their shoes for this. Buyer in writing to seller that they have loan approval, or they're waiving loan approval, or they have not got loan approval and they are cancelling. That's all the contract asks, is the buyer to tell the seller at the end of the loan approval period, I have loan approval, or I'm waiving loan approval and moving forward, or I didn't get loan approval and I am cancelling the contract. So when we talk about loan approval with conditions, there's nothing in there that says anything about that. So all we're doing is complicating the process. And we sometimes allow the other agent on the other side to complicate the process, because you'll have the listing, or the listing agent will say to you, I need to see something from the lender. Well, your response nicely is, well, you should have been talking to the lender throughout these 30-day period and making sure that your seller and you were comfortable that the loan approval process was going according to plan. So it shouldn't be a surprise to the listing agent that at day 30 or whenever you decided, the end of the loan approval period, that the loan was denied, or the approval was denied, or the buyer was going to move forward. But a condition, the buyer is good to go on so the buyer that writes to the seller says, yeah, I'm good to go, I have loan approval, but there is a condition that and everything else that comes after that is going to be irrelevant. You either have it or you don't have it. And it's the buyer's decision, not the lenders, not the agents. The buyer will decide whether they have loan approval or not. Once we move into this area here, once we have got loan approval, or we're waiving loan approval, if the buyer subsequently does not get the loan, then the seller should get the escrow. Up to this point, the buyer gets the escrow. If they cancel because they didn't get the loan, once they move past into loan approval, having given this notice, their escrow is at risk if they do not get the loan, with 3 notable exceptions. And the 3 notable exceptions are, I'm going to put appraisal, but it's a much more complex than that. Property-related condition. And then seller default. So example is, they borrowed 190,000. It's a 210 property. It appraises at 195. The lender says, I'm sorry, we cannot lend you 190 on a 190 value home. The appraisal of the property has not been sufficient to meet the terms of your approval. Therefore, we want the lending. Buyer cancels, buyer should get the escrow. And I'll come back and give you a bad example of this in a minute. Second one is, the lender says, yes, we will supply the loan, but it needs to have a new roof. And then the seller says, I am not putting a new roof on it, because they're not going to find out about the roof most probably until the appraisal time, which is normally after the 30 days. Buyer comes back and says, hey, we need to have a new roof. That's what the appraiser says. And the seller says no. Buyer has to cancel. Didn't get the loan because of property-related condition. I've used this on many different, or pled this case on many different transaction issues with condos where there was too many people in the condo complex that were renting. And we've been fortunate to get the escrow back. If it went to court, the judge might not say the same thing, but we've found that other brokers have been quite good at releasing the escrow if they wouldn't lend because the condo complex suddenly had, and it's not, you're supposed to do due diligence up front, but it's been found out later on when they've really dug into it that there was some misinformation about the condo complex, so they couldn't loan because there was too many renters in there. And then lastly, obviously, if the seller is in default, then obviously the buyer will get their escrow back. I know you're itching to go back and talk about appraisal. You can sit there.
Thank you, thank you.
I'll finish right. It's such a good lectern. The appraisal. So what happened? Is this an appraisal contingency? I say no. It is not a carte blanche appraisal contingency. There will be times where the lender is lending 100 and the buyer is putting 100 down. The lender will lend all day long if it comes in at 180. And the lender will commit some pretty serious offences if they fudge a denial letter based on the value of the property. Now, they've got checks and balances on their end, but they can't issue a denial of loan unless it truly was a situation where an appraisal didn't meet the value for the loan approval. So what does come into play though sometimes is the DTI. So if the buyer says, well, I could bring six or 7 grand to close in, the lender says, no, I'm still not going to lend because you haven't got 6 or 7 grand that we could source to bring, so we're still going to deny on that. So my advice is, the majority of times this will protect you if it doesn't appraise, but I would have the conversation with my buyer and say, if it doesn't appraise at the value of the offer that you've made, are you okay? And is your lender okay? Because I'm going to ask them as well. With you bringing money to the table if the seller will not reduce the price to meet the low appraisal?
2 questions, Murray. And typically when you come in and teach, I find out that I'm doing things wrong. So I just wanted to clarify what I'm doing wrong in this case. One, if the buyer does not in writing waive the appraisal or the financing contingency, then they've asked me something they've waived it.
Do you want me to answer that one first?
Sure.
Okay, so if at this point here, the buyer does nothing, they get to day 31 and they have not in writing told the seller that they have waived or not got, the buyer is in it. They are deemed to have waived it. However, if the buyer is silent, it opens up the door for the seller to have a time to cancel the contract, which is the first time the seller is ever going to have an opportunity to cancel a contract, comes, or apart from if the buyer didn't put their escrow in, is here. So on day 31, 32, and 33, the 3 days after the loan approval period, if the buyer has been silent, the seller may cancel the contract and give the buyer their escrow back.
Second thing is representing our, and because I do more sellers than buyers, I'm writing in that the appraisal contingency, let's say it's 30 days for the financing. We're asking for appraisals to be within like 21 days to tighten that up. So
Yes.
we don't get those, hey, we need a roof or we need this. Is that?
Perfectly acceptable. Yeah, and I see quite a few now, appraisal before inspection. So, you know, the buyer's saying, yeah, I'll buy your property, but I want to get this appraised first up front before we waste money on the inspections. And that's normally on properties that have been hard to sell. So that's paragraph 8. There's 8 or 8B. 8A is cash, 8B, and then 8C and D talks about seller mortgages and something else. I don't remember what the other one was.
Just to clarify.
Yep.
Just to clarify something. Okay, so going back to paragraph 8. So loan approval date is today. The TC will send out a message to the other side saying one of these 3. We have loan approval, or we don't have loan approval, or the last one we want to
cancel.
Right. So if that doesn't happen, what I'm understanding from what you're saying is that the seller has the right to cancel. Like that's a contingency on the seller that he could just cancel during that part if he has not received in writing a message that says we have loan approval.
Yeah.
Now, if he
I'll tell the story again. I tell it most probably way too much, and if you haven't been to my contract house lately, you might not have heard it. But this was a couple of years back, and I was coaching a team out in St. Petersburg, and they had a $1.7 million condo, and this was a baseball player was buying a condo, and it was a partly financed condo. The agent on the other side had been quiet right up until the loan approval window. They were sitting on a backup offer for cash from another baseball player, same team. And he was slightly more, and the seller wanted to take this backup offer, and the agent was acting as a single agent, said, just keep quiet. When we get to the loan approval deadline, if they have not spoken to us, because we've been sending them emails asking about stuff and they haven't responded, it came to day 30, crickets. At a minute past midnight on day 30, they sent a release and cancellation to baseball player 1, the finance deal, and accepted baseball players 2's cash deal. Obviously, at 8 o'clock the next morning, the buyer's agent all of a sudden found his phone and decided to call, say, hey, you can't do that. And everyone, we wanted to record the song, saying, oh, yes, we can. And you've just been punked. And then after I got joyful about it and thought, well, that's pretty clever. About 2 weeks later, one of our agents in the Mount Dora office had it done to them. So I became the recipient of that horrible message. So yes, the seller has that ability to cancel. So whatever you do, do not forget to let them know that you have loan approval in writing. And it's as soon, it doesn't have to be at day 30, it's as soon as the buyer is comfortable that they're going to get the loan. And that can happen very, very quickly. Conversely, I want you to remember this, it must come from the buyer. So if the lender tells the seller that the buyer has loan approval, that is not loan approval being issued in writing. And the example I use for that is the JetBlue pilot. I like to have color in my thing. So JetBlue, it's a little bit of, she was a pilot in Fort Lauderdale, being moved to Orlando, buying a house in Orlando at $400,000 because this is where she was going to be based. And we had the listing, we also had the buyer. The seller was an engineer, so he was on the phone every day to the lender asking how it was going. And the lender told him at day 28, yes, we have loan approval. I told the pilot she has loan approval. What was unknown to the lender was that the pilot was talking to human resources in Fort Lauderdale, and they were saying, we're going to be opening up our Caribbean routes, and we want you to be the chief pilot of that little section. No need for you to move anymore. So you don't have to sell down here, you don't have to buy up there. She had to go home and talk to her husband and say, you okay with staying in Fort Lauderdale? So there was a 24-hour lapse before she then went to the agent and said, I have not got loan approval. The residency requirement is no longer in effect. Therefore, I'm cancelling. The seller relied on the fact that he'd been given loan approval in writing, but he hadn't been given it by the buyer, was our argument. And as I had both sides of the deal, it was the seller was wanting to keep the escrow, and obviously the buyer wanted the $8,000 escrow back. And it took me a few weeks to actually talk to the seller and their attorney to try and get them to understand that at no time, according to the contract, did the buyer ever give written notice that they had loan approval. The lender gave written notice, which doesn't satisfy paragraph 8B. So what you want to do is talk to your lender. Like whenever I get a lender in a class, I always say to them, do never, ever, ever tell the seller that the buyer has loan approval. It's not your job, because it creates confusion. It's not wrong, it just creates confusion. So you should use words that only the buyer can give you the authority that they have loan approval. However, everything is progressing well because I have to tell you, give you an update as to the progress of the loan.
So forgive my being naive. How would the buyer give the selling agent, the seller, loan approval if they always communicate through the agent, through the buyer's agent?
I was talking to the whiteboard when I said it, so you might miss that. But whenever we talk about buyer and seller, it means buyer agent, seller agent. So the agents are standing in the shoes of the party. So if you think about offer and acceptance, when it leaves the hands of the seller or the last person to sign, it means leaves the hands of their agent.
Got it. So in this case, because the one thing that I'm not having trouble with in this particular part is, even though they have loan approval, that loan approval is still contingent on things and a few items before it goes to clear to close.
Okay, that's a great point. But it's I know this is going to sound, and I'm not trying to be condescending. Do you know what condescending means? I stole one of my favorite comedians, Jimmy Carr. He's rude, so don't look him up on YouTube, but he does things like that. And he's so funny. Yeah. He said misogynistic. It's a very long word, but don't you worry your pretty little head about it. I don't want to be condescending here, but here's how I think of this, and I think I've done one transaction in 10 years, and that transaction was because I dealt with my daughter's house purchase because she didn't want my wife to represent her as the buyer's agent because she said her mother was too emotionally involved in the process. So she had me do it, and I used it as and it was the worst transaction you could ever. There was probate issues on the seller side. It was a horrible transaction, but I remember sort of thinking about the loan approval process, and I said to her on day 28, she was with Movement Mortgage, was her lender, Jen Miklos. And I said, have you spoken to Jen about your loan? How, and obviously I'd spoken to Jen about the loan as well. But how's it going, Kate? And she said, it's going great, Dad. They want 2017's tax returns. I said, what do they need them for? And she said, well, just to confirm that my earnings were no different in 2017 earnings. I said, have you got them? She goes, no, because I didn't realize this, but apparently I pay to have her taxes done every year. That stops now. She said, the accountant. I said, what accountant do you have? She goes, oh, you're one. Really? Interesting. Let me look at my bill a little closer. So she said, he is trying to get them. He hasn't been in the office, but he's going to get them. Okay, well, you've got 2 days to get them. But other than that, are you going to get the loan? Yes. You sure? Because we're going to hit day 30. I'm going to tell them that you have loan approval. Are you comfortable with that? I'm comfortable with that. Called the lender and said, hey, is she okay? He said, yeah, as long as 2017 taxes say exactly the same as what she's had in 2018. She's a teacher. How different are they going to be? One extra apple was earned that year. Therefore, she said to me, yes, Dad, I am comfortable. I am moving forward. What I could have done is extended the loan approval window and waited for those taxes. But in this situation, she's not self-employed. I'm not worried about it. She's not worried about it. Yes, we have loan approval, Mr. Seller. We are moving forward. Here it is in writing. And that's all we have to do. So it's, in the old days, it was a piece of paper from the lender saying you have loan commitment, but, and then 57, so it really didn't mean anything anyway. Nowadays, it's the buyer's responsibility to step boldly into this area here with the knowledge that they're going to get the loan. So if they've lied, then tough. They're it's going to catch up with them. What the sad thing I find in here is when they've said they've got loan approval, and then what happens in this area is they lose their job. They get divorced. They buy a sofa from Rooms to Go. They do stupid stuff. Not divorce and lose a job, but they're buying a sofa from Rooms to Go. Those life happens in here, and they subsequently get their loan denied. The seller's going to get the escrow. But basically, poor old seller's been off the market to here for 30 days on tenterhooks, and now, if they've gone any further, it's only fair that the seller should be rewarded for being off the market that long. But what good agents do, good agents keep the other side completely up to date. Good agents work with good lenders, and I know we don't always have the choice, but there are some terrible, terrible lenders out there. Awful. And they don't understand the contract. They're only in it for the money. They do a barn door approach. They'll take anyone and say, yeah, you can buy a house. And they just work on numbers. If I can throw 100 people a month through this system, and if I get 5 through, then I'm happy. And then, of course, the casualties are us and the seller of that bad lenders. Don't let your buyers work with bad lenders.
This is helpful, by the way, and it covers everything. It covers the what I needed while you hit the loan extension part and the loan approval part, I always get baffled when I get a loan extension or an addendum with an extension request, and the other side never doesn't request to move the loan approval date.
Right, so I look at it like chains in a football game. If you're gonna move the closing because they haven't got the loan,
Both.
you know, then if you're still within the loan approval period, move them both. Keep the buyer, as a buyer's agent, you want to keep the buyer in this safe, warm blanket of the loan approval period for as long as possible.
Can you touch up on that for folks that don't understand why they should move both of those? What they actually mean, that there is a difference between approval and the closing date change?
Right, I think I said it, but I'll say it a different way. So if we get towards the end of the 30 days and closing's at 45 days, and the buyer still isn't comfortable they're going to get this loan, they've still got things going on that they're not in control of. So the underwriter has said, you know, we have a problem because you had a short sale back in whenever you were. We don't know whether we're going to get that loan at that point. That's still up in the air. The buyer doesn't know whether they're going to get the loan. So you would ask for an extension. We can't close because it's still in underwriting. We're still in the loan approval period. We're going to need another, they're going to need another 20 days or whatever. So you want to move this date up here and then the closing date out there. So you try and keep them as long as possible in that loan approval window so that when we truly get to the new end of the loan approval period, the buyer can comfortably say, I haven't got it, or I've got it, or I'm going to waive it and take the risk. And sometimes they just take the risk. It's $1,000 sometimes, and they just say, yeah, you know what, I think I'm going to get the loan. I'm not 100% sure, but hey, as agents, the best thing we can do is just put it on them, because what I deal with is disgruntled buyers and sellers where they haven't understood this process and the agent has left them out there. And so they haven't been able to make the decision. The agent's made it for them. Or they've forgotten about this date and they've just waived it.
For myself, throw some out there, Murray. And this will fall into my curiosity for myself, falling into the Y4C 2Ts. Women and all that stuff. I had a deal a couple weeks ago where the buyer's agent sent me an extension of the closing date. And I know darn well that she sent me essentially a closing date, but she didn't send me an extension of the financing contingency. The buyer had $20,000 in escrow for $1 million+ deal. I didn't want to tell her. Should I have said as a culture, should I have said, hey,
Right.
we need to do both, or my job is to protect my seller?
Well, that's where you bring up a whole issue of agency. You know, who do we represent? And as a transaction broker, we're representing the transaction, but we take things on their face value. We don't interfere with their process on the other side. Our loyalty will naturally go with the party that's paying us the money if we're the seller. But it really is entirely up to you. If you want to keep the deal together, and then it would behoove you not to say anything. Just say, oh, well, maybe they don't need that, and just move forward. I don't want to go into it too deeply because I don't want to show, I don't want to teach you to be corrupt, but it isn't really our problem.
Well, that's why I went with my seller's property been off the market for 45 days.
Yeah.
You know.
And I think if you clear, when we talk to people about bulletproof in a transaction, at the beginning of the transaction, by sending an email out saying, at the end of the loan approval period, we will be asking for your loan approval in your notification in writing from the buyer's agent as to whether they have loan approval or they're waiving loan approval. And that date is such and such a date. You've done your due diligence. If they choose to not be, maybe they don't want to the seller can always deny, even if they ask for it. They can always deny, no, I'm not going to give you. You've had enough time. You get this to the closing table. We'll extend your closing, but we're not going to extend this. And I see agents try to open up this window again. They've passed it, and they sneakily say, we need an extension on the loan approval period. Well, no, you've passed it. Because as soon as you extend it, they're going to cancel. Because they realise they missed it. Same with the inspection period. And we get that. Can we just have a few more days for the inspection period? It means it's gone past midnight and they forgot to do the cancellation. So that's it. That's paragraph 8. It's complex. It's not something that's easy to get your head around, but it's a process, and it's a fairly straightforward process, but it's complicated by the fact that the people on the other side that we're dealing with tend to want things that don't exist in the contract, like this loan commitment letter from the lender. That is paragraph 8. So, how are we doing on time? 9:40. Wow, that was an hour of my life. Did it feel like an hour for you?
No.
That's always good.
10 minutes.
4:20.
It was like that. It was like that last hour before last orders. 4:20. Yeah. So now I want to go on. I'm going to talk a little bit about the standard versus the as-is contract, and this will make your hair curl. Most probably I've become a victim of my own preaching, because more and more agents I've spoken to, mainly out on the Gulf Coast offices, really been pushing the standard contract. And I'm starting to reap what I sowed in that the agents that didn't come to my classes have been told by their mentors and people in the office, a person in the break room is my arch enemy. Well, I spoke to someone in the break room, and they said, so I'm getting people not following the process of the standard contract. And the biggest downfall, and I'm dealing with a massive case at the moment between two Keller Williams agents. One's an office that I represent, and the other office is not one of mine, it's one of Nikki Baldini's. And she has some very smart people that work for her, so they're on the ball on this. So my mettle has been tested. Our agent screwed up. So what happened is, with the standard contract, there is a process. And it's very, very simple. And there's lots of words around this process, but it's a very simple process. You have, and you can put this like, I'll make this a little bit bigger. So in the standard contract, you have the inspection period. I'll write it big for the Zoomers. Inspection period. So let's say 10 days. And during that 10 days of the inspection period, the buyer is going to do general repair inspection. They're going to do WDO, and they're going to do permits. Permits. They're the 3 inspections that the buyer may choose to do during the inspection period on a standard contract. On the as-is, they can do whatever inspections they wish on an as-is. They can inspect the plants in the backyard, do whatever they want. They can wander around, they can have their Aunt Cecilia come and do the inspection. On a standard contract, it has to be a person licensed in the appliance or equipment that they're looking at, or a person that holds a license, occupational license, as an inspector. So you can't have any old body come and do the inspections for a standard contract. It has to be licensed. During that inspection period, they can, and it lists in the contract what general repairs are. And sometimes when you call me and ask me to write an addendum for repairs on an as-is contract, and you think I'm being incredibly clever with words, generally I'll just take the words out of the standard contract because it's been well written by people smarter than me and just use them in the as-is contract in the repair request addendum. So it uses things like workmanlike manner or operate in the manner to which it was designed. So they in general repairs, it talks about electrical, it talks about the structure of the property. It doesn't deal with rubbish. It doesn't deal with curly roof tiles or cracked roof tiles. It deals with missing roof tiles. It doesn't deal with roof life. It just deals with damage caused by leaks. It doesn't deal with minor cracks in stucco. It doesn't deal with something like when I first came into real estate, I had to look up because I was British and we don't have marsite in England, and there's a thing called pitted marsite. Apparently it's to do with the swimming pool. But if the marsite in the swimming pool, the covering is pitted, that is not a general repair, that is purely cosmetic. So it defines what is a general repair and what is cosmetic. It stops your sellers being nickel and dime over, they want the carpet replaced because it's got dog stains on it. Carpets and curtains and all that kind of rubbish does not come within the general repair. So in paragraph 12 of the standard contract, it clearly defines what is going to be done, or what can be inspected and what can be repaired. And then in paragraph 9, it gives 3 limits of how much the seller is being asked to contribute to these general repair WDL codes. So in paragraph 9, the buyer may say, I want $1,000, up to $1,000 in general repairs. The place is fairly new, so I'm only going to ask for 500 in WDO and their treatment and repair. And in permits, I'm going to ask for 5,000. Because I know darn well that that extension that was put on the back of the house last year was done by some guy down the street and their permits weren't pulled. Or there's a home theatre in the garage. Man cave. So in paragraph 9, they ask for the limits, and then they're applied to this. So they do their inspection. The seller and buyer at offer stage, they decide, yes, we'll give you $1,000 in repairs. Yes, we'll give you 500 if there's any termites, etc. And then we know that we did pull permits, so yeah, you can keep your 5,000. We've got no worries on that. I'm not going to cancel you. The biggest error that happens in this is, in writing at or before the end of the inspection period, the buyer in writing through their agents give notice as to what repairs they wish to be done. And then ding, 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 ding. What happened in my major case, Murray versus the Albaldines, my seller went out and just got these things fixed. They were asked for moisture. There was moisture in garage wall. So my argument was that is not a repair request. That is a statement of fact. There was moisture in the garage wall. It should have said, and this is basically why we haven't lost this, is because it was both agents screwed up. This should have said moisture in garage wall, strip and replace bricks and mortar. That's what it should have said. Instead, it said moisture in garage wall. 3 days after this happened, Mr. Eager Seller went out, got one of his mates. They knocked out these crumbling masonry, filled it all in, did a beautiful job with the stucco, and that's not what the contract says. That's the biggest mistake. So you've got to say to your seller, here are the repair requests. You have now, the clock stops. Clock stops here for the buyer as soon as they make that repair request. A new clock starts, and it's the 10-day estimate clock. Once the seller has received the buyer's written request for repairs, a clock starts for the seller, And that means the seller now has 10 days in which to get written estimates for the requests for the repairs. It's not for them to repair it. Because another step has to happen before or at the end of 10 days is if the repairs are under $1,000, then the seller will agree to go ahead and have those repaired by a licensed repairman in that field or a general contractor. If it's over, the seller can elect to do the repairs anyway. And if it's over and the seller doesn't elect to do the repairs, the buyer or seller can cancel the contract. So let's just say it came back in at 2,000 and the seller says, yeah, I'll replace, I'll do that for 2,000. They're in contract still. If it comes back and the seller says, no, I'm only going to do $1,000, the buyer then says, well, okay, I'll just accept it as is condition. I'll take the 1,000 and we'll move forward. Or they can cancel. And they have a period of time in the contract, 5 days, in which to make that decision. And if they don't give written notice to, so if the buyer doesn't give written notice that they want to move forward or not move forward, then the seller has the opportunity to cancel. But the thing I want to get across to you, the most important part of this is, these are 2 distinct periods. There's the inspection period, the request to repair, the estimate period, then the conversation and reconciliation about these 3 things. And it's the same with permits and the same with WDO inspections. Exactly the same process. They get estimates and then they have the conversation, then they have the repair. So if you do accept one of these, or you do use one of these, or if you're told by the listing agent to use one of these, which is more likely to happen in most cases, just be careful in the process. I have a boatload of handouts on this, which are on the broker forum. I've published them on there several times. There's a draft letter to the buyer's agent at the beginning of the contract if you're the listing agent, not being rude, but just, or condescending, you're just telling them this is how the process works. If you know, this is how we handle this contract, so that you don't get to the point where they start, they do, because we have them when the buyer goes in, they see there's so much to be done, repair-wise, and they just cancel. Well, they can't. You've got to go through the process if they want to protect their escrow. Questions?
I have written in that section, the paragraph 9, a like asterisk $2,000 to cover all 3. Is that acceptable?
No. It would be 666 or whatever it is.
Okay, so it can't go cover all 3 of the categories.
No. I've seen it done, and yes, if you worded it correctly, you could get that. But it really needs, you can't combine them. So you get 1,000 for general repairs, and I've seen it Watson Realty teach that, where they put like a bracket and cross it out and just put 1,000 down for all of them. So, but you need to clarify that, because if it comes in as a 1,000 here, it completely screws up the contract, because you don't know, because it might be a 200 on the WDO, but 2,000 on that. So where are you cancelling on? How do you, it messes up that later process. This used to be the contract we used all the time prior to the great slump. Most of you were in high school then, or elementary school.
When was the slump?
2008, wasn't it?
I was.
Shut up.
Yeah, back then we used this type of contract all the time. Then all of a sudden, the bank owned properties and short sales, they designed the new as-is contract so that we didn't have to worry about repairs and stuff. And we've just kept with it. And it's kind of fallen into disrepute because it's forcing realtors to write really bad repair addendum. Are there any questions from home?
So I just have an overall question, because you mentioned writing bad repair addendums. So, I mean, at this point, everything I've heard, like, you're not supposed to actually be writing the addendums or any additional terms.
Right.
So is the expectation that we should tell the buyer every time to hire an attorney to write it, or write it themselves?
No, we can write so my general rule is we don't write anything. That's my general rule. If we're going to write things, then we're going to write them correctly. And so with repair addendum, it's been accepted that we can do a repair request addendum because we're just asking for something. We're not writing law as such. But we've got to be clear in that addendum. And you know, I've got scores of examples of where agents have had to buy things for buyers and sellers because they inappropriately and incorrectly wrote their repair request addendum. I've seen things like the air conditioner will be replaced, period. And everyone's signed off on it. And there's a beautiful broker owner in Orlando who we talk every month, at least once, because I think I've got 800 agents in the greater Orlando area. They're going to hit, and they're producing. I'm not like Charles Ruttenberg, where there's 2 people working and 1,800 people handing a license. Is this recorded? I said Bill Rutenberger. Yeah, I mean Rutabaga. That was it. You know, we hit each other every now and again, all the same brokerages, because we didn't track deals with them when we had problems. And this then just said that the air conditioner will be replaced. With what would be my question? And it wasn't there. It could have been replaced with a rusty bucket, and the seller would have done what the addendum asked them to do. So it cost the agent $8,000, and because the seller the buyer was saying, I asked for a new air conditioner, and the reason I asked for a new air conditioner was because it was insufficient to cool the home. It was too small. And so they talked about it, and they talked about it in emails, but the addendum, and when we came to the closing, they did the final walkthrough, and the air conditioner had been replaced with a brand new, exactly the same BTU, HOP, whatever it is you measure air conditioners with, as the one before. So what the goal is to write something that says, this is what we want, this is how it's going to be installed, by whom, and then reinspect, warranties, invoices. And if you hit all those points, and I've written a lot about this, how to do it. You can't overwrite a repair request addendum. You can be as specific as you wish with that. And I'm always happy to take a look at them. And if you think about it, the test in England for any legal document is, they call it the man on the bus test. If you walk up to someone on a bus and hand them that piece of paper and ask them to explain what it means, if they can't explain what it means, then it's incorrect. They call it it's the reasonable man test. But would a reasonable person look at that and say, yeah, I understand exactly what it is they want. But replacing the air conditioner is not going to pass the man on the bus test. He's going to say, oh no. So that's it. So always think of that. If I gave this to my spouse, what would they make of it? Mine is very critical. She said that she was going to watch one of my Zooms because someone told her that I talked slack about her.
We have a question here.
Yeah.
From Mo said, for an as-is offer, do we attach the FHA VA financing addendum with the offer? If it is an FHA loan, sorry if it's a simple question, he's a newer agent.
Yeah, if anything that's checked on page
I
11.
got this one. Yes.
No, it has to be, if you check anything on page 11, then yes, it must accompany the offer.
So I had this question from an agent yesterday that it was checked, but it wasn't included with the offer. So what happens then?
you're not effective. If it's it clearly says on the contract, there's a couple of bold lines that says these addenda are riders to the contract. And if you, how they get the term rider is it means they ride on the back of the contract. They are part of the contract. It's like missing page one if you haven't got it all. Therefore, you're not effective because there's been no meetings of mine. There's all the terms and conditions are not in the heads of all the parties. We have an ongoing one at the moment. Again, with an agent that I deal with a lot on the other side because she does a lot of business in Orlando. She's not with us yet, trying to get her to them. I give her more help than her. But she is, we put an appraisal rider on the contract. We're now at day 16 and the appraisal rider hasn't come back. So both agents have failed in their duty of care to the customer. Because not only did we produce it, we should have asked for it back, and the seller's agent should have made sure that her seller saw it and responded to it appropriately. So we're now at day 16, and we don't know whether we're protected if there's an appraisal shortfall. So we have not really got a contract.
So does that mean the executed date isn't until
Yes,
the appraisal continues?
until that rider comes back. Now, we're not going to hold them to that. We're not going to hold them to that. We're going to agree to move forward using the original effective date, but we've got to have an addendum which says the effective date of this contract is agreed to be this date. We're not, but technically, it wouldn't really be according to the contract but we can change that by an addendum. Sometimes I get asked, when's the effective date? Well, the effective date's when all the parties agree that you're effective. If there's any, well, it went at 5. I pressed the button at 11:30, but it didn't leave my mailbox because of an electrical shortage until 12:15. Well, yeah, we can argue all day long, what the court's going to say over that. Well, why don't we just all kumbaya, let's hug it, safely distanced, and agree that the effective date is going to be this date. And we can do that. A lot of hugging. We need more hugging. That's what the world is missing. Just ever since we stopped hugging, how horrible the world is. No answers.
Nothing else on?
Nothing.
I have a question. We did a contract class last Thursday. We talked about assignability of a contract. I've been doing this a long time, and it's only come up one time in 100 years. And Jen, what's her last name? Nash had a contract come in on a property in Gloria Park that was a newer agent wrote it up, and they wrote in could assign the contract and not be released. Why would they do that?
Oh, yeah, I advise people to do that.
Okay.
The reason I advise people to do that is especially if you buy investment properties, sometimes you want to put the LLC in the name of the investment property. So you want to call it 123 High Street LLC. But you don't know if you're going to get it at the time that you make the offer. So I make the offer under Murray Coleman, and I make it assignable and not be released. So that halfway through, I can assign the contract. When I know I'm almost at the closing table, I create my LLC and I close it in the LLC's name. That's one time that you would do that. There's no real risk to the seller because there's been no relinquishment of rights. It's just been and it stops you from having, because I'll give you a couple of, an example. When we had a naughty seller on the other side, who just is point blank refusing to allow the buyer to change the name on the contract halfway through. Well, if they've signed to say it's signable but may not be released, the buyer doesn't care whether the seller gives permission to change the name or not. And sometimes they want to buy it and they don't know whether they want to put it in a trust, they don't know what they're going to do. They won't know until they actually get it.
Speaking of assignability, just a real quick, just because it makes sure I'm thinking. So I've always heard that if it's not specified, a contract will be automatically assignable. Is that true or not?
No. One of those boxes has to be checked.
Has to be, because I've heard of none of them check, because I see this very often, because obviously I'm in the investment side, and a lot of people do that. They try to sneak in assignable contracts, but not check anything
Right, so here's where that would fall down. One, it would come on the agents for failing in their duty of care to their customer. So that's a big black mark against the agents, and the agents could get themselves sued if they didn't. And the seller's got some responsibility in checking the contract as well. But where there is an asterisk, it says it must be filled, unless in brackets or parentheses after it says if left blank. If you have that default, but otherwise it has to be filled, otherwise you don't have a meeting of minds.
Gotcha.
So don't read it, don't believe everything you hear on a 3 o'clock commercial.
I used a separate contract for
I know.
assignment, but
Thank God. So assignability. The other thing with assignability to be careful of, and this has only happened once, 14,000 transactions last year, and this happened once, but it still could happen again. They had an assignable contract on a condo, and there was an approval process for the condo board. A little old lady in New Jersey, always New Jersey for some reason, they were buying a condo in St. Pete, and there was a board approval. Now these board approvals in St. Pete are almost like the Spanish Inquisition. They are very strong on their, we're only going to let certain people in our condo association. A little old lady comes down to St. Pete, sits before the board, and they deem her worthy of being in their condo association and give her permission. A couple of days later, she assigns the contract to her living trust. The trustee is her son, or whatever it is, not living trust. Trustee is the son. The board then gets sight of another contract that had been assigned because someone in the title company told the board, and the board said, oh no, we've only approved little old lady from New Jersey. We haven't approved this trust owning it. The trustee now has to come and be interviewed. Creates all kinds of confusion and nonsense. So just if you do have condo associations that have approval, just be very guarded that there could be a repercussions if they assign the contract before it, because they've only given permission to that person that's actually for them on the board. They have co-ops in St. Pete. We don't see many of them around here. Deal with co-ops quite often. I always think of Seinfeld when I deal with co-ops. New Yorky type things. They're pretty prevalent out there on the Gulf Coast.
Because they're all from New York.
Huh?
Because they're all from New York.
They are from New York. They created their own little world down here.
So we have, what actual phrasing and additional terms should be used to have seller pay closing costs or to request that they pay?
Good question. So the seller, just a straightforward statement of facts. The seller will contribute up to, if you're the listing agent, you want to see an up to in there. Or if you're the buyer's agent, you want to put a proper amount. So the listing agent should always counter up to, because otherwise you end up with buyers standing there on closing day. Where's my $250? You only spent $6,000 on it. So up to $6,000 or whatever for closing costs and prepaid items. It's as simple as that. Be very careful about not putting a figure. There was a horrible one a few years ago where it said, in paragraph 20, it said, the seller will pay the buyer's closing costs and prepaids, period. No amount. So the buyer thinks, I'm just having an attorney take a look at all this for me. And so the attorney then sticks in an invoice for $5,000 and the buyer slips that into the title company and says, my closing cost. And ended up with the, it truly is, because it says there right there in paragraph 9, buyer's attorney costs. So that came out of commissions.
And we also forget the purchase price.
Yeah.
If you want to speak to that, 3% of closing costs, so people forget.
3% of closing costs does not mean
purchase
purchase price.
I see that one still.
Yeah, no, I prefer to see a figure. You can work it out real quick what the figure is, and get as close as possible to it, and then just add 500 and say up to. It would be the safest way to do it. So for the listing agent, a set figure is okay if you know it's going to be less, but do up to if you think it's going to be
3% of closing costs.
Yeah.
No, 3% of the closing
Here's
costs.
$280.
Yeah, there you go.
If that. Here's $20.
We can give it to you with a Home Depot. Yeah, we have to be very clear. We have to really read stuff a couple of times to make sure it makes sense.
So is it, because I'll get a lot of questions of how do you want me to write this? And I generally say, speak to Murray. Is that what you want me to
Absolutely.
continue to do? Okay.
You know, here's how I explain it. When I did the team leader job very, very badly for a very short period of time, I remember I just walking down the corridor and God, I can't remember his name now. He had his own brokerage in Hunters Creek, the king of Hunters Creek. Jerry. You know, he'd come out and he'd ask me a question as I'm walking along, and I thought, oh, that's what I love doing, and I'd be quite happy to do that. And then what happens is when you've been out of it for a couple of weeks, these things don't stay in your brain. You know, I know you guys can go to a class and then the very next day you're thinking about making a postcard on command or doing some kind of campaign, and all this stuff goes. Now, I'm looking at these 12 pages every day, so you know it's easy for. And most probably in my phone, I use notes in my phone. I have all these. Every time I write one, I just keep it. So I guarantee you, all I'm going to do is change a few words and send it back to them. So it's easier for me to do it rather than you, because you've got to get back into that thinking role and take off your hugging everyone team leader,
Right.
whatever team leaders do.
Yeah.
I know.
That's all we do, Murray. Hugs.
Hug people.
Hugs.
Shout at the MCA and hug people. That's how I remember being a team leader. Jerry just did it. Wow. Name from the past.
Any other questions out there?
Yeah, I have one more thing I want to cover and then we can wrap this up. I can't remember what it was. Offer and acceptance on the multiple offer situations. And it's just a feature of the market at the moment because of the way the market is in certain areas, that we've got listings with multiple offers on them. And it's creating, you know, I've talked to a lot of other brokers about this, and we all agree that, you know, we've all got to learn to work together in the future, and we're starting to people are making enemies out there because we're not being polite in our handling of multiple offers. And I remember back in the day, in 2008, I was helping my wife out. She was a broker. And I used to just help her out in the office now and again. And I remember a guy who was the king of REOs. And at the time, everything was REO. If you weren't an REO, then you really weren't in the real estate business. And I had a big REO agent in my office, and there was this other REO agent, and it was guaranteed that if you had a question or you had anything, you would not get an answer. You just treated like absolute dog's poo. And then the market went away, the REO market went away, and then this person's then going to have to try and work normal real estate. And people have long memories. And still to this day, I still remember this guy, and I have to work with him now and again on the committee. And I keep thinking, you were such a bugger. And you were just rude and inconsiderate. The market will change. And we've just got to stay in relationships with agents on the other side. Even, doesn't matter how bad they are, it's easier for us to take the high road and be nice. If I get an agent call me shouting, and it's guaranteed 3 or 4 calls a day from a co-broke agent shouting about one of our agents has done this and done that, I am so sweet to these people. I am so sorry this has happened to you. I could care less what comes out of my mouth. I haven't got to win. I haven't got to fight them. All I've got to do is just show compassion. They're going to move on with their lives. I'm not going to lose any sleep at night. I'm not going to go and, you know, I'll call brokers sometimes and point out something that what their agent's most probably not doing right in a transaction. Could you nudge them a little bit so they can get this back on track? And they'll start defending their agent, even though their agent's completely wrong. I go, well, I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry you're having a hard day. It's a simple process. We're just going simply in a route. So just incorporate in your, like you were a victim of harassment on a multiple offer. Just if you're the listing agent, just send a text to everyone or get your assistant, send a text to everyone saying, we've received your offer. We're not going to be able to give you a reply for a couple of days. Please let your buyer know their offer's on the table. We'll get back to you as soon as possible. And then they're happy. Because what happens is they need to tell their buyer, they needed to tell their buyer something, I think, in your situation. And he gave them an answer, and they were still unhappy because they didn't get picked. Well, that we can't help. We just move on. We've got to let them be angry and move on. But if you're driving around with a buyer and you've got an offer in and you haven't heard anything back at all for days, and you want to get a house sold for this person, and they're asking you for updates and you can't give them, you feel like a fool. So you end up making stuff up. Yeah, they called me. They said they're going to make a decision soon. And what happens is these buyers from other agents are out there, my agents are being bad and not updating, they call me and they say, I have an offer with one of your agents, what's happening? So then I have to make a phone call to my agent and say, hey, what's happening with this? And they say, oh, yeah, they're all on the table. Why can't you just tell this buyer's agent that? Why am I speaking to their buyer now because they're unhappy? Because what the agents are doing is, here's the broker's number, call them. And so it will cut down a lot of calls for me. So it's just a process. It's just, so, we're looking at it. We'll let you know in 2 days' time. Sorry, your offer wasn't accepted. They went with a different offer. Never a better offer. They went with a different offer because it might not be better. Get them ones as well. But it then closes 2 months later and they call up and say, oh, my offer was a lot higher than the one that they accepted. Why was that? Was it because it was in your office? Is what they say. And sometimes it is, and sometimes there's a very good reason for that. But there you go. So that's it.
What explanation do you go any further?
What?
What explanation do you go any further, specifically if it is in the same office or something like that?
I don't give them one. I just say that was the offer that the seller chose. We're not going to do anything corrupt. So, it is what it is. And if my agent did anything corrupt, then on their own heads would it fall. But I would think 99% of the time, our agents, will not fudge a multi-offer situation nor to get their own offer on the table, because basically you're going to end up losing your license real quick. And I have one at the moment where we have an agent supposedly going to the board because our team had the listing, multi-offer situation, and then our buyer was the one that the seller picked. And the seller didn't pick it because it was the best. They picked it because it was one of the listing agent's team. Smart move by the seller, wouldn't you think? So the person that had a $5,000, exactly the same financing, $5,000 better, when it closed, is now complaining that our team hogged the deal. So I at the time, it came up because this agent was very vocal at the time when the offers were going in. She's a former Keller Williams agent and hates the team that she's again. And I actually called the seller and I said, we've had this allegation. Before we move forward, can you explain to me why you picked this particular offer when it was lower than other offers? And she said, because it was on what the buyer's agent worked with my listing agent, and I would have my listing agent is fantastic. I would have full confidence that we were going to go to the closing table. There would be open and honest communication. I'd much prefer to work with this than have $5 more from someone else. And their argument was, well, you didn't ask for a highest and best. We don't have to ask.
Who cares?
They don't have to.
So,
People are whine about anything. It's just sore losers. No, you can't blame them. There's paychecks involved, but sometimes the highest offer isn't going to win.
so German wanted me to ask, what is allowable in section 19, additional term section of the contract, and more importantly, what is not?
19.
The additional terms.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
20.
Oh, he said 19, additional term section of the contract.
Does he mean other? I'm just going to check because he's not.
Okay.
He never gets it.
Yeah. Probably.
19 is the addenda, and then 20 is additional terms. So there's an other section when you check in. I think that's what he means. paragraph 19, it's got all the riders, A through double C, CC rider. And then you've got other. The one thing that is not allowed in there is seller's real property disclosure. Because on page 1 of the seller's real property disclosure, it says in bold print, this must not be made part of the contract. By checking other and putting that in there, you're breaching your duties to Florida Realtors, who specifically said that's not to be made part of the contract. Because it's not, it's a disclosure, it's not been written to be part of a contract. What else couldn't be in there? That's about it I can think of. You might have another thing.
Oh, he said, my concern is creative language in section 20.
Okay. And yeah, and German's great because he'll send me cut and pastes of some of what people have written. I'm going to write a book one day. You know, I've seen things like, you know, all garden ornaments, gnomes, fairies, and the Peter Pan at the bottom of the garden will convey. You know. The only thing I think you should ever write in there is closing costs and prepaid requests. Everything else is covered by a rider. I see people write, this is contingent upon the sale of the buyer's property. Well, then use rider V, because it has far more words and protection for the buyer. So you're failing again in your duty of care if you don't use rider V and they have a house to sell. If there isn't a rider and you feel the need to write something in there, then speak to me. Be careful not to write lease terms in paragraph 20. And lease terms can be open or they can be hidden. Someone in Oviedo yesterday, they want the seller doesn't mind if the buyer moves property into the house prior to closing. They want to start moving furniture in, and they're in the contract stage, and they wanted to write in the contract, the buyer will move in 3 sofas and an armoire prior to closing. That's a lease. And when you go to U-Haul and you rent a little space, you sign a lease to put stuff into that little space. So a real estate agent can't write a lease. You can't write something which allows someone to use someone else's property. So you would use rider T in those circumstances. So pretty much there's nothing you need to be writing in there apart from prepaids and closing costs. If you feel the need to, then talk to me. You'll see a lot like Coleman Banker, I think, at the moment have this whole big cut and paste thing that all their agents are putting in about COVID and about permits. So an attorney's written it. If that's what they want to do, then that's fine, but it's just all nonsense, basically.
We have, what's the best way for a seller to counter an offer? What about using the counter checkbox at the end of the contract? Should it be used? The seller signed the contract with the box check and changes initialed by seller.
That would be, in a perfect world, that would be great. There is also a Florida Realtors offer and counter offer form that you can use, which is very good. But generally we don't. We're basically lazy, which is fine. I'm the same way. But in writing and signed is the only real enforceable way. I do get people that are very upset because the buyer will counter or the seller will counter in a text. The buyer then says, oh yeah, I'll go for that. And then in the interim, the seller just withdraws it and goes with someone else. So if you haven't got it signed quickly and in writing and signed, then you've got nothing and you get very unhappy people.
So the way she said it is ideally the way you want to see it.
Yeah. That would be perfect. But it doesn't happen.
Imagine, especially in this market.
Yeah, the other side is going to say, well, no, I don't want to deal with that. Just you know, let's get the price agreed and then we'll write it up and go from there. But it creates opportunity for buyers and sellers to be unhappy because of people just butting in on the deal, with, as you say, with everyone coming in, all these multi-offer situations and buyers.
What's the best way to deal with these agents tacking on their brokerage fee?
It is what it is. That's what the offering is. If you work in the Sarasota area, you would meet Dollar Donna. The Dollar Donna has a brokerage in Sarasota, and the buyer commission is $1. So, that's the market. So if the other side wants to put 3% minus 250 or whatever, that's what the offering for the commission is. You can always try and negotiate it away. Good luck with that.
I think, so I do remember doesn't having some sort of solution, I think.
Oh yeah.
I don't know the legality of my solution. I don't know the legality of my solution.
Bringing up Guido is a good idea.
They were like chilling words. When I heard Desmond has oh no, here it comes. I'm just like, take me now.
So what I did before is in section 9, where you can put other costs to be paid for by the seller, I stuck their transaction fee back in that section.
Nothing wrong with that.
Boom!
Nothing wrong with
Well, how
that.
about you put your transaction charge on there?
Okay.
Oh, I did.
Yeah.
That's what I did.
So let me just qualify that. So what you have to do though is talk. Your buyer has obviously got to be aware of what you're doing.
Correct.
You don't want to jeopardize the.
I had a great relationship with the buyer.
So here's what we had a situation I thought was very clever is there is a team that I work with who they always want 3% commission, and if it's an offering of 2.5%, they have a buyer broker agreement which says the buyer broker agreement says if our commission offered in the MLS is less than 3%, you agree to pay the additional, bringing our commission up to 3%. And how they do it, and it will be of no cost to them. And how they do it, they just stick it into the buyer requested closing costs. So if the seller's offering 2.5, the buyer will ask for 7,000 in closing costs, of which 1,200 is going to go to their agent. Now it depends on the market, how effective that can be, but one way or another they're going to get you. So the buyer's agreeing to pay the shortfall, but really the seller that ended up paying it.
Gotcha. So me sticking their transaction or my transaction fee into the seller to pay closing costs is legal.
It is, as long as your parties are fully aware of what you're doing.
You'd be surprised how little people check section 9.
I talked about that in class, Thursday, like, make sure people slide stuff in
Because
here.
people put.
Oh, it gets slipped in there all the time.
Yep.
You'd be surprised how many agents
I know.
don't check that.
I think, when anyone says me contract review, that's pretty much number 2 on my list of what I look for. I look at that and the paragraph 20 and then that, see what they've slipped in there. And sometimes I've seen it in paragraph 20 where the print has been so small and it's almost like it looks like it's part of the contract and you just completely, your brain skips over it. You have to really look carefully.
Anything else?
Everybody buying your insurance right now, please.
Oh, I know. I have a flip that's
No,
waiting to close.
I have one right now.
I'm the seller on a property.
Is this hurricane thing going to come through here? It's kind of looking.
No, but nobody's writing insurance right now.
Yeah, everybody's.
Susan, how much I know. I stopped watching the news when Kennedy announced his presidency. No, I just have not been watching television. So let me know when it's supposed to come out again.
Yeah, well, thank you very
Oh,
much.
you're
That's a
welcome.
great class,
You
Mike.
had
Thank you.
over 25 people online,
Oh,
so
great.
you had a great group in here, and we'll make sure I get this posted on Facebook as well, so.
Cool beans. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Anytime, they just call me.